And we're on. Hello, everybody.
Hey.
Welcome to Let's Talk Coronavirus. It's Wednesday. Hooray! It is hump day, that's right. Which is just, I can't get that camel commercial from a few years ago out of my head anytime anybody says that.
That's the camel go advertising.
I know, it's problematic. Anyhow, I'm Rachel Bergstrom. I teach biology and I also teach in the Health and Society program at Beloit College. And I'm here today with, of course, Ron, go ahead.
I'm Ron Watson. I also teach here at Beloit College. I'm not just some random guy who's on this program. I teach in our political science department as well as our Health and Society program. And today we have with us two wonderful guests, one who is a repeat guest who apparently can't get enough of our show, and a new guest. So let me start with our new guest and then we'll come over to our repeat. So Lisa.
Hi, my name is Lisa Anderson-Levy. I teach in the anthropology department and in critical identity studies.
All right, and Leslie, please.
My name is Leslie Williams, and I teach in the anthropology department and in HEAL.
Right. So, and HEAL is our code word for health and society.
Yes. Sorry.
No, right? Because we all just say that. Oh yeah, I'm a HEAL. I was like, why are you talking about healing yourself? Right? So
well, and Phil, our other normal co-host for this particular season, is of course on vacation this week. So we miss you, Phil. And then of course, a huge thank you to Whitney Helm, who has made this all possible. So hey, Whitney, thank you. So just as a reminder, we've got, if you're watching us on Facebook, we do take questions in the comment section there. So feel free to add them there. I'm also going to post, as many of you know, this season is part of a class that we are teaching for incoming first-year students at Beloit College. And it's called COVID, a Pandemic is More Than a Disease. And this week we had an assignment of listening to a podcast from the 1619 Project through the New York Times. So I'm going to post the link to the 1619 project in the comments here so that you can also connect with that as we go through. So one of the exciting parts about this class is that we're thinking about the complexity of COVID and of a pandemic and of life in a pandemic, and thinking about what the past, present, and future looks like. Last week we were talking about economics. This week we've got two anthropologists, as we know, and we're going to be talking about some of the historical basis of our healthcare inequalities. And so, Lisa, I was wondering if you'd like to start us out a little bit to talk about. You were the one who selected the 1619 Project podcast for our students to listen to, and you posed some questions for our students too. And so, I was wondering if you could introduce that for us.
Sure. So thank you. And thank you to both of you for inviting me. This is super fun. So part of why I thought it was important to listen to that podcast is that it does a decent job sort of laying out what happened in the past in terms of how people understood health and the connections with race and racism. And some of those things continue today, and the podcast does a good job of kind of doing those through lines. In any case, before we begin our conversation, I wanted to share just pull a couple of things out of the podcast. So one is the connection between, thinking about science or research, both in, traditional science fields and social science. With a recognition, all research in science and all knowledge production in general occurs in specific cultural contexts. And the big example that comes out of this is about this theory, this Black extinction theory that they mentioned, and I want to talk about it for just a second. So if we think about knowledge production as coming out of particular contexts, then it matters who's asking the questions, what sorts of questions get asked, what counts as data, and how are those data interpreted. So the person who came up with this theory is a guy called, or was, Frederick Hoffman. And he wrote a book called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro at the end of the 19th century. And he was a prominent statistician who worked for Prudential. And in this book, he came up with this idea of Black extinction because so many Black folks were dying, at the end of the Civil War, post their enslavement. And his theory was that after decades of being enslaved, they were now biologically unsuited for freedom. And part of why I'm mentioning this is because this goes completely, 360. It's the opposite idea, opposite science from the science that from decades before this time that said that Black people were actually biologically suited for hard labor, right? This is why enslavement made sense. And that they were not only suited for hard labor because they were bigger, they were stronger, and impervious to pain. And so both of these theories happen in particular social contexts that required Black people in particular, to be understood in different ways. So that's one thing. And then a second thing is the idea and the worry about creating safeguards against the dependency of Black people. In other words, the podcast talks about that, the federal and state bodies did not want to create hospitals for Black people because that would make them dependent. And so here again we go, for hundreds of years, enslaved Black people worked for 12 to 15 hours a day, 7 to 8 or 6 to 7 days a week. I almost said 8 days a week. And now all of a sudden, at the end of their enslavement, everybody's worried that they're going to be lazy. I mean, if you think about it, that makes zero sense. So then you have to ask, what else is happening? So how did people pay for healthcare at that time? Well, turns out they did what we do now, right? Which is you have to have insurance. And if you have to have insurance, you have to have a job. And not just any job, you have to have a particular kind of job that will allow you to have health insurance. So if Black people received federal or state sponsored healthcare, why couldn't poor white people? And then if poor white people get the same sort of thing, then what might happen if poor white folks and Black people saw themselves in similar struggles? Right? So investments in whiteness and anti-Blackness underlie these policies that harm low-income folks regardless of race, right? Even though it's still the case that the added burden of racism makes increases the precarity of Black folk. Anyway, that's all the framing I have. Thank you.
But I think that what's interesting about that is there are direct lines that can be made from those systems that were in the middle 1800s to what we're seeing right now in 2020. And we're focused primarily on COVID here, but COVID really is a symptom of a bigger problem, right? We're seeing that there are disparities. Black and brown people are suffering more from COVID, dying at a higher rate from COVID than white people are. And it's a direct link to these systems and these thought processes around how health is supposedly different in some ways, depending on the color of your skin.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so, and I'll just say this and then I'm done. So if you think about how it is that we are one of the richest countries in the world, and yet our citizens have to be employed in particular kinds of work in order to get health insurance. That seems crazy to other people in other parts of the world, right? So, you know, what are we prioritizing? Clearly, it's not the health of people, right? We're prioritizing something else if this all has to go through insurance companies. So who benefits? Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent, absolutely excellent framing and excellent point, Lisa. I mean, it's one that I've tried to make in a variety of different, from a slightly different perspective, but in a variety of different contexts as well. And I always ask folks, because we had some of our students ask questions about universal health care, right? Well, wouldn't universal health care make things better? It's like, well, yeah, probably. I mean, yeah, maybe. It all depends on the resources that would be made available within that system, right? But one of the questions, the reason why that one stuck out to me is because when we think about universal health care, people often ask, well, you know, why didn't the US have universal health care? Why you look at other countries, the sort of peer nations, the other sort of democratic countries of the world, the older democratic countries of the world, and most of them were able to do substantially universal healthcare systems decades ago, right? So what's the problem with the US? But I always ask folks, well, what would a universal healthcare system have looked like in the US in 1943? How about 1953? How about 1963? Right? I mean, this is part and parcel of the issue here, right? Is that when we try to remove from this entire calculus the reality of what a segregated, racially apartheid America was, and it was apartheid to the core. Black folks obviously couldn't share drinking fountains, but also could not even share boxing matches. This is, blind black kids and blind white kids couldn't use the same books. I mean, these sorts of things, depending on the state, were very, very extensively regulated and managed. So, you can't hardly even imagine a universal system because by definition, it wouldn't be universal, right? So at any rate, that's my 2 cents to throw in on that one. Leslie, what are your thoughts here? Let's see if we can pull you in here.
Yeah, so I think that, so I'm a biological anthropologist, and so I consider a lot about how biology and culture affect people, in particular how biology and culture affect human vulnerability to things like disasters, and a pandemic is a perfect example of a disaster. And we know that there is differential vulnerability across different race and age and genders in the United States when it comes to things like disease. And we see it play out very clearly in the effects of the pandemic. It's a far greater effect in Black and in Latino communities where we see such high rates of morbidity and mortality. And so I think a lot about how vulnerability is linked to cultural things like what you've been talking about access to healthcare and what that looks like, but also it's linked to the way that our culture impacts our bodies. And in this case, there's a concept in endocrinology and in neuroscience, right up Rachel's alley, that's called allostatic load. That has to do with the effects of repeated stress over a long period of time on a person's ability to defend against disease, to defend against malnutrition and other things like that. So we know that stress, whether that's economic stress, whether that's psychological stress, whether it's the very clear stress that we see in the form of racism, affects people over time and affects their ability to respond to diseases. So we can sort of see from multiple sides the ways that racism and structural racism and inequality is impacting Black and brown bodies in the United States, in that it is coming from the social and economic lack of access to things that would help people prevent the disease. And it's also coming from the long-term effects of being in these highly stressed social contexts over long periods of time, making it more difficult for people to actually resist diseases themselves. And we see this, of course, not just in the face of COVID, but we've seen it in other pandemics as well. So that's sort of the things I think about, is the way that if we fixed, for example, universal access to healthcare, and in fact ensured that everybody in the country was able to see a doctor, was able to get prescription medication that they needed, and didn't have to worry about going into substantial financial debt in order to do so, that still doesn't fix the problem. I mean, it goes a huge way, but the systems that create racism and that create stress in communities that are affected by racism also impact people's health.
And I guess if I may add to that quickly, Leslie, one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking is, yes, and that would involve sort of changing how physicians are trained, how all medical professionals are trained, so that race becomes, so that they develop a certain kind of fluency with thinking about and understanding structural racism. You know,
exactly.
One of my favorite examples for thinking about, a really stark example about how race impacts bodies, is research that was done on pregnant women, right? So pregnant women in the United States Black pregnant women in the United States who come from someplace else do not have trouble with low birth weights and poor outcomes. However, their daughters who were born in the United States and live with racism since the time that they were, in the womb, those children, so the next generation of women, have low birth weights and have poor outcomes with pregnancies. And that's such a clear example, right? If you are balancing for social class and all of that, and you're just thinking about that one person grew up in another context, it's a powerful story about race.
Yes, it is. And Lisa, the research that you referenced, that's David and Collins, and that sort of was a gigantic part of my own research. As some of you know, the focus of my dissertation was, in fact, infant mortality, right? And that study that David and Collins performed, and they actually, I think, ended up doing a couple of iterations of it, it really put to bed a lot of these assumptions about why we were seeing low birth weight and hence higher infant mortality rates, because we know that the relationship between low birth weight and very low birth weight and dying before age 1, that's a very strong one. But that research really put to bed a lot of these arguments that, again, the podcast that you recommend in the 1619 project is really sort of pointing at this, that you have these folks who were trying to make the argument for a long time. We don't know why Black babies keep dying. It must be genetic, right? And well, if it's not genetic, then what would it be? Because what else could it possibly be, right? But in fact, in that research, they really hammer home this idea that, yeah, if you're West African, because again, if it's genetic, and given how mixed all of us or something like 80% of us are in the United States, that theoretically the purer African genes should mean that problem should be exacerbated, right? I mean, that would be the normal expectation. But yeah, it's not that way. And yet that second generation is extraordinary, right? That's the sort of nail in the coffin of the effect of racism. Yeah.
When you see, to go with what you're saying, Ron, I mean, it plays perfectly into the narrative that's surrounded the differential vulnerability of the coronavirus too, is initially people are asking that question, is there some sort of genetic basis for these differences that we're seeing in morbidity and mortality? And of course, all of the anthropologists are jumping up and down and going, that's not it. It's clearly, I mean, obviously, you know, genes play a role in many things in life, but when we're looking at what we see now, I mean, this is so clearly the overwhelming effect of the environment on people's health, and that narrative crops up over and over and over again, and it is deeply tied to what Lisa was talking about too, about these perceptions about Black folks and about difference and otherness that are linked to very much to the racialized notions of slavery in the United States. I mean, it goes all the way back. We keep, even within the modern scientific establishment, people often go to genetics as an explanation when really we should be looking at environment first and foremost, because our genetic controls are not particularly good. And environment is such an overwhelming factor in what we're looking at.
Absolutely, absolutely. Rachel, I see you posted something in the chat, so why don't you jump in?
Well, we've kind of moved past it, but I want to go. I want to bring in some of the questions from that the students posed in class. Again, one of their assignments is that after we have our discussion on Monday, they post some questions for us to discuss today. And so I'm thinking about some of the questions that the students have asked about systems of racism that impact more than just, you know, little itty bitty sections of their lives that really spill over. And so one student actually asked about redlining, which I think is an interesting connection. And so the question is, has redlining had an impact on access to healthcare in Black communities? And I think we can kind of, I mean, the answer is yes, right? But I think we can kind of extrapolate to talk a little bit more about how deeply entrenched and complicated this problem really is, and how it impacts all aspects of our lives, which you know is where we're going. But thinking about redlining specifically in the context of COVID, for example, like how do we think about that connection there?
Do you want to start, Ron, or you want me to go?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in on some of the more superficial elements of it, right? So first of all, what is redlining, right? So redlining is this process by which, and this situation in which banks in particular would literally draw a red line around certain, like on a map, right? So this is back when people used to use, you know, paper. So they would literally draw a red line around certain communities, and those communities would have very strong difficulty, if not be completely ineligible to receive housing loans and other sorts of loans and financial assistance that banks could provide. And so if you think about the knock-on effect of that, right? If you live in one of those communities, and if you were fortunate enough to have a house, well, you know, you want to try to improve your house, right? So if you live in a different community, you get a home equity loan, right? You bought your house for $50,000. Someone appraises it and says, actually, it's worth $100,000. So now that means you got basically $50,000 worth of money you can play with, right? If you refinance your house and do all this kind of stuff. Versus, and so that gives you access to, in effect, $50,000 that you can utilize. But if you're in a community where you had a house and that community got redlined, right? The value of your house will only decline, right? It can't improve because no one is ever going to be able to, unless they come up on cash somehow, they're not going to be able to use equity out of their home. So just if you think about what the knock-on effect that would have on communities, that's enough in and of itself. But you also think, if you think about hospitals and clinics and all of these sorts of organizations as businesses, and then you think about businesses themselves, right? Businesses are not going to be inclined, nor any other organization, to go to a community where the housing values decline. Why? Because that is associated then with an increase in all of the social ills that real estate has taught for decades that you want to avoid, right? So that's going to be higher crime, higher unemployment, and all of these sorts of things. So Yeah, in that sense, redlining absolutely affects the healthcare circumstances of folks, because it's then not only is it likely that if you get a hospital at all, it'll have to be a state-supported hospital in all likelihood. But if you get a hospital at all, it's probably going to be of a lower quality, period, right? That includes in terms of the doctors, because you got to find people who are willing to live in a messed up community or willing to commute a long way, which we know from experience is not true. Like, most people don't want to do that. But it has knock-on effects for everything in your community, right? Including, even if you happen to have a good hospital, then what happens with the resources there as they get sort of overused, as it were, from all of the problems that are local. Now, Lisa, I'll kick it over to you.
Oh, after you covered everything, you're kicking it
Oh,
over
my
to
bad.
me. The only thing I would add that you refer to but didn't name is that communities that are redlined the people who live there have zero opportunity to build wealth.
Right.
Which is what happens in communities of color all the time, which is why, people sort of talk about, well, but look how long ago slavery was. Yes, it was a long time ago, but when people live in communities where they're not able to build wealth, it means that they have nothing to pass on. And it means that, these are the numbers that you hear about the typical wealth of a white family in the United States and the typical wealth of a Black or brown family, which is almost always more than half of that.
And Leslie, before I come over to you, Lisa, I actually want to jump in on something you said, right? So one of my issues is I often hear people, just like you do, right? People say, oh, slavery was so long ago. But I also go, but was it though? Because there are people who are still alive, who are like 105, 110 years old. Mm-hmm. They are human beings alive today who are 110 years old. So we'll go back 110 years, all right? So we're back in, we're still in the early 1900s. Mm-hmm. But that means that those people were born only about 50 years in some cases after the Civil War happened. Absolutely. So it's actually not just two longish human lifetimes ago. Right.
Well, and the other piece of that is, whenever I hear this thing about how long ago it was, so it took a lot of policy, sort of political, economic, it took a lot of social structure to create the infrastructure, first for slavery and then for Jim Crow, right? There are a lot of rules, a lot of places people couldn't go. People had to create, some parts of the country had to create two of everything to accommodate, right? What is the infrastructure that we have created to dismantle all that? What is the political or social or economic infrastructure that we have created to help us dismantle all of nothing? We just said, it's over, we're done, no more Jim Crow. Now let's live in peace and harmony.
Right, there's not even a Freedmen's Bureau or the equivalent of the Freedmen's Bureau. That's right. I think that's extraordinarily well said. Leslie, you want to jump in on this before we go to another question?
I'm happy to move to the question that Rachel just posted.
Okay, right on. So Rachel, you want to carry this on?
Yes, this is from an alum, Ellie Waddle.
Hi, Ellie.
So the question is, many years from now, when anthropologists are studying COVID-19, what kinds of conclusions do you think they'll be able to draw about this pandemic, both from a biological and social anthropology perspective? And related also, what kinds of methods do you think would be most helpful to them outside of looking at academic papers and studies, since there's so much contradiction and uncertainty in the news and social media? So we can kind of break that into two separate questions. I'm fascinated thinking about what epidemiologists are going to think about, and anyhow. So anthropology, tell us.
You want to start, Leslie?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if we think from an archaeological perspective, because that's the time frame I tend to think on, that would be, at least 100 years probably from now, looking back and looking beyond the written record and looking at the material record, the things that are behind us. And I don't know, maybe maybe we find a layer in the dirt of all of the masks and lots of sourdough bread and all of the various things that to keep up during the pandemic. I mean, there's so many different, there's lots of different ways to think about it. We know that, for example, we studied pandemics in the past as archaeologists. There's been a lot of them. Some of the most severe ones have been so culture shattering that that the cultures post-pandemic didn't look much like the cultures pre-pandemic. But people have gotten through them. People are resilient and have managed to move on. So I think that there's a person, an archaeologist in the future is going to be very interested in how it is that we within our various different cultures, because of course this pandemic is affecting people across the world. Those of us in the United States are hyper focused on the US response or lack thereof to the pandemic, but I mean the pan in pandemic is referring to the fact that this is a worldwide or global phenomenon, and different countries are responding in different ways, and we will see evidence for that in the material record. We'll see evidence for that in people's bodies, and so I think a future archaeologist would be looking back at the differences in the ways that different cultures approached the pandemic itself. So that's me with my bioarchaeology future hat on. Lisa, did you want to jump in?
So I'm a cultural anthropologist. What that means is I talk to people. You know, I'm interested in what stories people tell about what's happening now. So many years from now, hopefully we'll be listening to podcasts, we'll be listening to or reading actual stories that people have told about their family members, about themselves, or if we're trying to avoid, you know, Ellie's question says no academic papers and studies, but there are lots of ways that we can find out what's happening based on other kinds of art production, right? So, you know, thinking about ethnography, which is the primary methodology of anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, see how I got that in. So if we're thinking about ethnography, it's not only about the scholarly texts, it's what kind of art is coming out of this time period, what kind of music, poetry, what are people sort of talking about, both at the level of the larger society, right? In terms of maybe newspapers and so on, but what's happening in small communities, what's happening in families. And those are the places that I think that we'll get some good information about what happened. And so this next question in the chat is about why we don't teach this in schools. So let me just say.
Can I give a little bit of framework for that?
Do it, please.
Because I think that this is a really interesting question. We got from our students in class, at least 5 or 6 out of the 20-ish noted something about this was the first time that they had heard really about how healthcare disparities are linked to the bigger social construct of racism. And I think that that's really fascinating and really telling for us, and also something to be really aware of right now when we're in the middle of a pandemic where we're really literally seeing this play out in real ways, and it's actually being talked about. Maybe not completely, but it's being acknowledged in a way that I think it hasn't been acknowledged before. And it's being part of the bigger narrative in the news, or it's become part of the bigger narrative in the news. We maybe aren't, approaching it correctly. We're still looking at this idea of genetics, I think a little bit too much. We're not thinking about the whole system. But we had all of these questions that basically boil down to, why was I not taught this in school before now? Which I think is a really important question for us to address. So that's the framing that I want to give. Ron?
So let me, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, unless you think that this is, you know, just because, oh, nowadays they just don't teach kids nothing in schools, right? Unless you think is that, while I knew something about health differences up through graduate school, I did not have any idea until I made the conscious decision in, I think, 2010 to actually say, you know, let me look into something like infant mortality and see what the situation is there, right? Because I read something that said there was this huge gap. I was like, well, that can't be right? Because everybody loves babies, right? It turns out, no, that's not true either. But up to that point, I didn't know that that the disparity was as great as it was. I thought, oh, maybe it's just a, you know, 1 to maybe 1.3 or 1.4. No, I had no. At that time, it was 3 times greater. It's extraordinary, right? And that's to say nothing of maternal mortality, the racial difference there. So, so this isn't a new phenomenon, and it wasn't just you who wasn't taught. I think healthcare is thought to be sort of sacrosanct in some way. So anyway, Lisa, just sort of kick this to you, please.
Well, so I guess I would say that healthcare is one, or disparities in healthcare is one small part of what's not taught. So, you know, as the parent of high schoolers, I see what they're learning, and the information that they get about the role of enslavement in the history of the United States, and how that continues to impact our economic systems, health systems, education, and so on. That is not taught in any kind of systematic way across the country. Why? Because we live in a land of states' rights that allows some states not to teach about it at all. And it's possible because, you know, we see those students in our courses. It's possible for students to get to college and not know about the massacres in Tulsa, in Rosewood, in Detroit, in LA. And those are recent history, right? Not even deeper history. So I think that there's an understanding, I would say, that children don't need to learn certain kinds of facts about their country. Of course, you can tell by the way I'm talking about it that I don't agree with that sort of perspective. And that, I think that's why it happens. So it's not just health disparities, it's all kinds of unpleasantness.
I also wonder too, I said this in class, and maybe other people have had this experience, but I just saw Hamilton for the first time. And it was lovely. It was lovely. I hadn't been a big fan before, but now I get it, people.
We are waiting in the wings for you.
But it, you know, that last song in Hamilton, Who Tells Your Story, right? That is, it's stuck with me in a powerful way, you know, to think about it, to look at Hamilton, to think I'm seeing history that I've maybe sort of been taught in the past, history that was populated by white men, now being portrayed by people of color. And there was something for me that was extremely powerful about that. And I think that other people have had that. I don't think my experience is all that unique, right? But it's a combination of factors too. What can children handle? But also, who has decided what is worth teaching in general? So I say this also at the same time that I'm listening to the Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi on Spotify. It's available for free. I strongly recommend it. But that's also been a really interesting example to me of the history that I was taught. Who did it come from? Versus now the history that has a different perspective and a different goal, really, to think about how do we build our knowledge of what actually happened That's, I think, another really interesting thing to be thinking about. So, yeah.
And it ties, Rachel, directly into to the work that scientists do as well, because the work of science is embedded in the cultural context of the scientists. And in this case, you can think of it as not just, who tells your story, but, what questions do you ask? Because the asking of those questions that underpins a sort of empirical, evidence-based scientific process is linked to the identities of the scientists. And I think that, and certainly I would say in the last decade, many aspects of science have really begun to recognize this, take hold, and discuss it certainly at the sort of scientific society level. But until we truly understand that scientists are people, and the research that we do is, as much as we would love it to be, perfectly, pristinely objective, is always going to be influenced by the moment in which we do that work. And so again, it's not surprising that students don't learn about this in school, right? Because it's being influenced by that same narrative. What we teach and the questions we ask are influenced by cultural narratives.
So this is interesting too, because in terms of as somebody with biomedical science training in neuroscience, I understand deeply what you're talking about there. The questions that are asked go through a lot of filters, or the questions that actually get to be borne out to research go through a lot of filters that I wasn't aware of when I was in graduate school. I wasn't aware of that filtering, even as I was experiencing some of the negative effects of that filtering in my own progress, right? And so I've been thinking a lot, especially since being at Beloit, how do we team up with anthropologists, for example, and I've benefited strongly from working with the two of you to understand how do we think about the actual culture of science, and how do we think about how we can still exist in that culture and still be doing the work that we're trained to do, and on top of it, how do we broaden the field to welcome those questions, to recognize those questions as valid, even if maybe we can't answer that question yet, but to say yes, but first we got to get to this, and then that'll help us answer that question. That's something that I think is really, really interesting to work on at a place like Beloit, because I get to work with people outside of my discipline who help me think through that. So anyhow, just a plug for Beloit College there, people. We'd love to have you.
Beloit College. We got it. Rachel and I just have to get this kind of stuff out every now and again, right?
We really like it here.
As it turns out, we do.
So anyhow, but I guess the question is then too, like, in thinking about, broadly speaking, we have generations of Americans who are unfamiliar with all of this. Right. And we're at a point in our own history where I think people are trying to pay more attention. And so how do we, maybe as anthropologists, biologists, public health specialists, educators, how do we think about this particular question of entire chunks of history and entire chunks of patterns of behavior and patterns of economy and patterns of politics and patterns of biology and patterns of disease and health disparity? How do we work on that? It's a big question.
So I can start and then chuck the ball to somebody else. So one of the first things I know I tell my students is just sort of get it out of your head that this is fixable by you or any one person this semester. Because no, right, these are persistent challenges that we have been living with for hundreds of years. So that doesn't mean, though, that we ought not address them. What it does mean is that we have to develop what I think of as a kind of both intellectual and social stamina, right? We have to be able to think about these heavy, right? Heavy and sort of connected pieces over time, right? And we have to be able to use a way of looking at the world that I actually learned from someone else, Dr. Hooker, thinking about hope, right? Because one of the things that crushes students' sort of interest in this work is that it's endless and often thankless. And then on top of both of those things, it's hard. Well, yes, but if you think about this as what's required, right, for kind of rebuilding this house that we have started to build in the United States, if you think about our world like that, then it becomes easier to imagine what we're doing as hopeful. And it is hopeful, but it's not a kind of superficial Pollyanna hopefulness, right? It's a kind of deep, loving hopefulness that sustains the kind of work that we're trying to do, because so having people sort of see the realities of other people is really hard, right? Because we all live in our own spaces. And we have to begin to see each other's realities, or we are not going to change how any of this rolls out and continues to roll out. And the more we can begin to see from each other's perspectives, and if we can do that, that'll answer or get to some of the challenges around learning these histories, right? Because in order to see from my perspective, you need to understand something about the history of Black people, right? Whether it's from my homeland in the Caribbean or from here, right? So as we begin to do that with this deep hopefulness and thinking about hope as a skill, I think that we will get there, because the idea that we won't is unacceptable to me, because then it means my demise. And I'm not paying into that.
As it turns out, Lisa, neither am I. Not playing that game. Not playing the extinction game anymore. No. So yeah, I mean, I really do appreciate what you said about stamina. I think that is really what this is all about. That and a deep sense of hope. Part of being such a young country is that sort of collectively we haven't grown up yet. And I often compare the United States in terms of our group behavior to like a petulant teenager that's like the biggest, strongest on the block. So everybody's kind of scared to like stand up to him, right? Because they know, Johnny will punch you in the face, right? And again, recognizing that over time, hopefully, if we have time as a nation, that we will sort of mellow out and start to recognize, oh, we can't just punch our way out of situations. Like we have to actually start to have relationships with people and maintain those relationships. And that's sort of key. But at the same time, I think that stamina, because the questions are so hard and the facts are so horrifying, right? I mean, it'd be something different. It was like, the US had indentured servants. Like, okay, so, well, no, they weren't beat or anything. And, it's like, and then after their period was up, 7 years, sometimes they got renewed to 10 years. Oh, shoot, we're talking about human beings in a marketplace being treated as cattle, magazines dedicated to how to breed your slaves. I mean, this is extraordinary stuff that is harsh. It is painful, but the reward in the knowledge of it is unlike anything else. if you can accept it, if you can have the stamina to accept it. But it sure doesn't make every day happy sunshine, though. I can say that. Leslie, you want to jump in on this?
It's hard to come after what both of you have said regarding this. I think that you have you've sort of hit every aspect of what I would want to say, because there is such a such a ebb and flow of frustration and a sense of it being a sort of fruitless fight that happens. And I think sort of the phrase when Lisa was talking, what I was thinking about was militant empathy, sort of this this tremendous need to see the world in the context of other people around you. And doing that actually would have tremendous inroads into starting to dismantle the system, because systems are made of people, right? And one person can't necessarily take down an entire system, but many, many, many people can. And it's recognizing where the system is and where the actions of people are being guided by it and restricted by it that ends up being so important. I'm reminded of a concept in medical anthropology that's called structural violence, which has to do with the ways that the system causes harm to people's bodies by nature of all of the things we've talked about so far in terms of access to healthcare and the ways that things like racism or other types of inequality affect somebody's health. And I'm reminded that this sort of research into an understanding of something like structural violence should underpin the ways that we look at society in the past and in the present, recognizing that not everyone is affected by every event in equal ways. And that militant empathy goes a long way to really being able to do that. So thank you, Lisa and Ron, for what you said.
Not at all, not at all.
Yeah, that is, I think that you've pointed out some really important features to think about for students, in the literal sense students, but we've had a comment on Facebook: learning is a lifelong endeavor, both a hopeful and difficult one, exhausting and exhilarating. And I think that the recognition of this learning as a process and learning as a tool of dismantling structures of racism as a part of the system, right? I think one thing that really sticks out to me, Lisa, is what you say to your students at the beginning, that you will not fix this semester by yourself. In this class, we will not take care of it. But through the work that you're doing in the class, you're contributing to a longer process of supporting others and ultimately, hopefully someday, getting to a point where we do have a just and equitable system where we do actually support one another in the way that we aspire to.
Absolutely.
And I will just say, as my sort of last piece here, is that bringing it all back to COVID, right, is that when we think about what this disaster has meant and the various ways in which certain segments of the population have reacted to it, it really strikes me that this militant empathy piece is the piece that's missing. I'm one of those people who, technically speaking, is at risk. And so I wear my mask when I go out, but I wear my mask, yes, to protect myself marginally, but the reality is I wear it so that in case I am an asymptomatic carrier, I don't cause someone else harm. I don't want that on my conscience, and no one should, right? Now, of course, at the same time, having grown up impoverished myself, I recognize that there are many folks who are sort of struggling and they have struggling businesses and so on and so forth. And I think we should not dismiss their concerns either, right? But at the same time, I think that empathy has to be something that flows all around us, where we are constantly thinking, okay, what can we do? Well, do we need to up our stimulus to these individuals? Do we, do I need to wear a different kind of mask? What do I need to do? The idea that, well, I shouldn't wear a mask at all, that's troubling, right? Because it means on some fundamental level, you lack a sense of empathy for other people. And I think that is the, if anything, if people are going to take anything away from this experience, I hope it's that you recognize that we can't act without empathy for other folks, because it only prolongs a disaster like this, right? It doesn't actually make it go away. We can't wish this one away. We got to do some hard stuff to make it stop, and we are not there yet.
We are definitely not there, and I think this next 6 months is going to be really telling. This is where we as a community of a countrywide community need to really dig deep to find that empathy, and to recognize the humanity of our fellow citizens to do the work that we need to do. This all sounds very like hand waving, but it really is, it's true. You have to pay attention. You have to recognize that the other people on the street are other people on the street that we have to take care of, and that we have to wear our masks for. We have to maintain our social distance, and we have to also at the same time not lose focus on the other work of contributing to dismantling other sources of social inequality. So we're going to end it there. We're at time, people. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everybody who was able to join us today. We will be back next week to talk about philosophy and allocation of resources during COVID, which is totally related to our conversation here today. And so it's been really fascinating and wonderful to see as each week of this class has built on one another, as we've talked about biology, political science, economics, and now anthropology and philosophy. It's all connected, and it's been a really rewarding set of conversations for me and Ron and Phil. And so, as we always do, Lisa, yes, you have one last thing to say, and then we'll close up.
Well, I was just gonna say quickly that the one positive thing about this pandemic, if you want to think about it like that, is that it has the sort of vulnerabilities that only some people used to feel are sort of expanded. And this is an opportunity, and I want to use a different word than Leslie did, but means the same thing, an opportunity to expand radical empathy, right? So that we're caring for each other, and every day we have opportunities to do that.
Right on, right on.
All right, thank you. So we end every week with a little check-in, because we are all humans here, and we've got to survive this pandemic just like everybody else. And so I'm interested to know, Leslie, what are you looking forward to this week?
So my sabbatical is starting. So I am very, very excited to take a little break, and then get working on research for the fall semester. So that is very much what I am looking forward to.
Excellent. That sounds wonderful. And Lisa, how about you?
I look forward to the walks I take around the Rock River every day in this beautiful weather in summer in Wisconsin.
It is delightful out there. It's a great walk. Go ahead, Ron. What about you?
Looking forward to consuming more calories as I produce another fruit-based dessert. We got some blueberries in the fridge that are calling my name. I already made a lemon blueberry pound cake that I've been told should be sold in stores. So I'm like, well, what's the next thing I can do, right? So let's do it.
That's excellent. And I'm looking forward to, just upstairs right now, my parents are up with my child and my spouse, and we're going to have dinner together. So I am so looking forward to that right now. So, all right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again here next week at the, same time, same place. I'll be sitting here. Ron, you'll be sitting there.
I'll be here. I'm in the grotto. I'm always in the grotto.
Excellent. Thank you again, Lisa and Leslie, for joining us, and we'll see
Thank
you
you
again
much,
next week.
Take care, everyone.